Well, good evening and welcome to our school's sixth webinar in our Civic Discourse project this academic year. Our theme this year being Race, Justice, and American Leadership. I'm Paul Carisse, Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, and we're delighted to be joined by prominent economist, social critic, and Brown University professor Glenn Loury to discuss his views on why Black Americans today should have pride in the American project and their role in it. Part of our school's mission is to promote civic dialogue about pressing issues of our time, and each academic year, our speaker series, the Civic Discourse Project, extends the conversations and debates of our classrooms to a broader community. You can visit our school's website to see all of our previous lectures in the Civic Discourse Project and to learn more about our school's curriculum and programs. That's at scetl.asu.edu. We'll have three main parts to the hour this evening. First, a presentation from Glenn Loury. Then I'll pose some questions in conversation with him. And in the third part, we'll have a Q&A session from the virtual community that is joining us. So while Professor Loury is giving his remarks, please do type your questions for our guest using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Our colleague, Dr. Carol McNamara, will be collecting those questions, and I'll be posing them to Glenn in our final segment. So now to our very distinguished guest. We are delighted to be welcoming back to our school Glenn Loury, who spoke at our annual conference just a year ago. He's joining us from Rhode Island on what he tells us is a quite snowy evening there. Glenn Loury is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Economics at Brown University. He holds a bachelor's in mathematics from Northwestern University and a Ph.D. in economics from M.I.T. As an economic theorist, he's published widely and lectured throughout the world on his research. He publishes mainly in the areas of applied microeconomic theory, game theory, industrial organization, natural resource economics, and the economics of race and inequality. Professor Loury is also among America's leading critics writing on racial inequality. He's been elected as a distinguished fellow of the American Economics Association, as a member of the American Philosophical Society, and of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a fellow of the Econometric Society and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before coming to Brown, he taught previously at Boston, Harvard, and Northwestern universities, and also at the University of Michigan. Glenn has been a contributing editor at the Boston Review and was for many years a contributing editor at the New Republic. He's published more than 200 essays and reviews in journals of public affairs in the US and abroad, and he currently hosts The Glenn Show on Blogging Heads TV. And you can see he's equipped in his home studio. So Professor Loury, Glenn, thank you so much for speaking in our series on race, justice, and leadership this year, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thanks very much, Paul. Very good to be with you, and thanks to all who have tuned in. I'm going to make my remarks, and then we'll have a back and forth. I want to talk about race and American citizenship. I want to ask whether the currently fashionable standoffishness, characteristic of much elite thinking about Blacks' relationship to the American project, as exemplified, for example, by the New York Times 1619 Project, serves the interest, rightly understood, of Black Americans. I think not. Indeed, I think a case can be made for unabashed Black patriotism, for a forthright embrace of American nationalism by Black people. The America ain't all it's cracked up to be posture that one hears so much of these days is, in my view, a sophomoric indulgence for Blacks at this late date. In fact, our birthright citizenship in what is arguably history's greatest republic is an inheritance of immense value. Here, I will endeavor to defend this stance and to draw out some of its implications. I have four main points. First, consider that what happened in 1776, the founding of the United States of America, was vastly more significant for world history than what happened in 1619, the first arrival in America of African slaves. The narrative we blacks settle upon about the American story, about the American project, is fundamentally important. Is this basically a good country that affords boundless opportunity to all who are fortunate enough to enjoy the privileges and bear the responsibilities of American citizenship? Or is this basically a venal, immoral, rapacious bandit society of plundering white supremacists founded in genocide and slavery and propelled by capitalist greed and unrepentant racism? Now, of course, there is some warrant in the historical record for both sentiments, but the weight of the evidence, I would argue, overwhelmingly favors the former. I wish to argue that the founding of the United States of America, 1776 to 1787, was a world historic event by means of which Enlightenment ideals about the rights of individual persons and the legitimacy of state power got instantiated for the first time in real institutions. African slavery flourished at the time of the founding, that's true. And yet within a century of the founding, slavery was gone, and people who had been chattel became citizens of the United States of America. No, they were not equal citizens at first. That took another century, far too long, I agree. But African descended Americans became, in the fullness of time, equal citizens of this republic. The United States of America fought fascism in the Pacific and Europe at the mid-20th century and thereby helped to save the world. Our democracy, flawed as it most surely is, nevertheless became a beacon to billions throughout what came to be known as the free world. We stood down under the threat of nuclear annihilation, the horror, which was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Moreover, we have witnessed here in America, since the end of the Civil War, the greatest transformation in the status of a serfdom people, which was what the emancipation of the slaves affected in the creation of what used to be called the American Negro, the greatest transformation that you can find anywhere in world history. 40 million strong, we have become the richest people of African descent on the planet by far. The issue then is a question of narrative. Are we going to look through the dark lens of the US as a racist, genocidal, white supremacist, illegitimate force, or are we going to see it for what it has been over the last 300 years, which is the greatest force for human liberty on the planet? That is worth fighting about. With the Black Lives Matter activists, with Colin Kaepernick and his cohorts, and with the editorial staff of the New York Times, and with officials who will exercise power in the presidential administration of President Joseph Biden. That's my first point. Secondly, consider the freedom legacy of the American Civil War. The Civil War, 600,000 dead in a country of 30 million. The incredible trauma. Now, people will say that the war wasn't fought to end slavery, it was fought to preserve the Union. Lincoln, they'll say, would have been happy to see the Union preserved even if slavery had persisted. And I expect that this is correct, although Lincoln surely abhorred slavery. But the fact of the matter is that the consequence of that war was, together with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution enacted just afterwards, to make the chattel, the African slaves and their descendants, into citizens. They were not equal citizens, that's true. They were made into citizens of the country, and in the fullness time, after 100 years, equal citizens. Should it have taken 100 years? As I've said, no. Should they have been slaves in the first place? No. But the thing is, while slavery has been a commonplace human experience going back to antiquity, emancipation, the freeing of slaves en masse, the movement for abolition, that is a relatively new idea. It's a Western idea. It's an Enlightenment idea. It's an idea that was brought to fruition here in the United States of America over a century and a half ago, liberating millions of people and creating the foundation for the world that we now inhabit. This great achievement surely would not have been possible without philosophical insights cultivated in the 17th and 18th centuries in the West. Ideas about the dignity of the human person, about the limitations of government, and about what legitimates the exercise of government power over other people. Something new was created here with the founding of the United States of America at the end of the 18th century. Slavery was a Holocaust out of which something emerged that I think actually advanced the morality and the dignity of humankind. In other words, the abolition of slavery and the incorporation of African-descended people into the body politic of the United States of America was a world historic achievement. That's my second point. My third point is this: consider the astonishing transformation of status for Black Americans that occurred in the 20th century. To those who poo-poo the American dream as irrelevant to Black people, I wish to say the following. Have you even bothered to notice what has happened in America in the last century? When the economist Gunnar Myrdal published An American Dilemma in the 1940s, this is the Swedish scholar brought over by the Carnegie Endowment to survey the condition of the Negro in American society at mid-20th century. The typical occupation for African-American men was farm laborer, and the typical work of African-American women was domestic servant. The median family income of Blacks relative to whites was about 0.5. The status of African-American education, of African-American voting rights, of citizenship, of African-American access to the professions was abysmal. This is within my lifetime. Look at what has happened in the last 75 years for African Americans. A huge middle class has developed. There are Black billionaires. The influence of Black people on the culture of America is stunning, and it has global resonance. Blacks are the richest and most powerful people here in America in large numbers of African descent on the planet. It's not even close. There are 200 million Nigerians, and the gross national product of Nigeria is about $1 trillion per year. Americans' GNP is over 20 trillion a year, and we, 35 million African Americans, have claim to roughly 8 or 9 or 10% of it. Do the arithmetic. We have access to 5 times the income of the typical Nigerian. Indeed, the very fact that the cultural barons of America, those who run the New York Times and the Washington Post, for instance, or who give out Pulitzer Prizes and National Book Awards, for instance, or who are at the MacArthur Foundation and who run the human resource departments of corporate America, the very fact that they have all bought into the new woke racial sensibility hook, line, and sinker gives the lie to such pessimism about how the American dream doesn't apply to Black people. It most certainly and emphatically does apply, and it's coming to fruition daily. Who thinks the American dream is a fraud? Are you kidding me? Tens of millions of people have come to this country from every corner of the world in the last half century. Within my lifetime, again, most of them from non-European points of origin. And when you take a look at what has happened for these immigrant populations, you can see that they are realizing the American dream. This is an open and free society. So my basic point is that to dismiss the American dream for Black people is to tell our children a lie. The narrative that white supremacy has put a knee on the neck of America, of Black America, is simply false. The idea that as a Black person, I dare not step from my door for fear that the police would round me up or gun me down or bludgeon me because of my race is simply ridiculous. That's like me not going out of doors for fear of being struck by lightning. The tendentious interpretation of every one of these incidents where conflict has emerged between the police and an African American, such that it's read as if it were the latter-day instantiation of the lynching of Emmett Till, that posture is preposterous. My fourth point, consider what achieving true equality for Black Americans actually entails. I am reminded amidst the contemporary turmoil of the period after the emancipation. There was then a moment of pro-freedman sentiment during Reconstruction, but it washed away and was followed by the long, dark night of Jim Crow. We Blacks were set back. And yet, notwithstanding this, the early decades after emancipation witnessed some of the greatest achievements of African-American history. Consider that the freedmen who were liberated in 1863 were almost universally illiterate. And yet within a half century, their increased literacy rates came to rival anything that has been seen by way of impoverished mass populations acquiring the capacity to read. This was of enormous significance because it brought them into the modern world. Today, we look at the Black family, lamenting perhaps the high rate of births to mothers who are not married and so forth, but this is a modern post-1960 phenomenon. In fact, the health of the African American social fiber coming out of slavery was remarkable. Books have been written about this. Businesses were built. People acquired land. People educated their children. They acquired skills. They constantly faced opposition at every step along the way. No blacks need apply, whites only, this and that and the other. And nevertheless, they built a foundation from which could be launched a civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century that completely transformed the politics of the country. As my friend Robert Woodson is fond of saying, when whites were at their worst, we blacks were at our best. Such potentiality seems now to have been forgotten by many as we throw ourselves on the mercy of the courts, so to speak. There's nothing we can do until America repents of its racism. Our kids and communities are troubled, and we demand that you white supremacists save us. This of the very same population about which such a history of extraordinary accomplishment under unimaginably adverse conditions can be told. So I say now that pull yourself up by the bootstrap is more than a cliche. It is an imperative. People laugh, they'll roll their eyes. But I say to fellow Black Americans, we must take responsibility for our lives. No one is coming to save us. It's not anybody else's job to raise our children or to pick up the trash in front of our homes, etc. We must take responsibility for our lives. This is not fair. History has certainly dealt us a raw hand. Life is full of tragedy and atrocity and barbarity. This is not fair. It's not right. But such is the way of the world. If you want to walk with dignity, if you want to be truly equal, then recognize that white people cannot give Black people equality. Black people have to actually earn equal status. Please don't get angry with me because I'm on the side of Black people here, but I'm saying equality of dignity, equality of standing and respect, equality of feeling secure in your position in society, equality of being able to command the respect of others. These are not things that can be handed over to us. These are things that we have to wrest for ourselves against a cruel and indifferent world with hard work, with our bare hands. We have to make ourselves equal. No one, no matter how well-intentioned, can do it for us. Fortunately, although we Black Americans must confront this existential challenge, we have the benefit of doing so while residing in a free, prosperous, decent, and open democratic society, which is why there is nothing contradictory or oxymoronic about, at one and the same time, being willing to declare oneself a Black freedom fighter and an American patriot. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, Glenn Loury. Let me start with the title that you chose for these remarks, which I believe is meant to recall Frederick Douglass's address in 1853, which he delivers on the 5th of July, because he does want to recognize the 4th of July, but also raise the question, you know, what country have I, whose 4th of July is this? And you are replying that after the achievements of the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, and the failures and successes thereafter, but then also the benchmark of Gunnar Myrdal coming here, you know, in the 1940s, the progress marked by Black Americans, by Americans generally, to overcome the Holocaust of slavery, to legalize desegregation, and that now means that Black Americans have a country. In response to Frederick Douglass's question, saying they ought to have a full country, they ought to be fully part of the country, your answer is 160 years after Frederick Douglass's address, the answer now can be Black Americans have a country and they ought to be proud of having a country. Is that one way of summarizing your remarks?
Yeah, I'm going to take that, Paul, to be a very friendly amendment. In fact, I wish I had incorporated it into the presentation, because it is indeed Frederick Douglass, that fabled, famous address that he gave. This is before the emancipation. This is a escaped slave who is speaking to us, the great liberator. This is an abolitionist and a Black man. And what should America think about the ideals of the founding, given that here we are now, if he's in 1853, it's fourscore or whatever after the founding. And what should African Americans think? He was cautiously hopeful about that prospect, but he was indicting the audience to consider the gravity of the circumstance and the profundity of his standing before them, in effect pleading with the country to stand up to its own ideals. That was in the 1850s. Here we are now in the year 2020, and I gave the litany of the recitation of what has changed between now and then. And yes, I am saying precisely that. The question that Frederick Douglass asked, which when asked might have left the listener puzzled about what an answer might be, has been answered by history. It's our 4th of July. It's our 4th of July.
Yes. Could I follow up on that by quoting back to you Thomas Chatterton Williams, who was the last guest we had in this series,
Sure.
Because he quotes you a few times in his 2019 book, Unlearning Race, and especially the idea that, according to Glenn Loury, the American bedrock idea is the goal of racially transcendent humanism, and that a terrible history of racism does not cancel that idea and their ideal. And we were talking on Martin Luther King Day, and so Chatterton Williams was saying, yes, King was right to say that the American dream is possible, that human beings can interact with each other on the content of their character rather than predominantly on the basis of various racial identities and biases. So what do you think of Chatterton Williams invoking you in that way? And am I correct in seeing that your remarks today are in agreement with that point of view?
Yes, they are. I'm friendly with Thomas Chatterton Williams. I know his books, A Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race is, I think, a very valuable contribution to the current discussion. And I do think he gets me right. I'm flattered. I mean, he quotes me. That's terrific. But what I want to say is I see two different issues here, and I'm not in disagreement with what you just said, Paul. I see one issue about the country. What kind of country is this? There's another issue about how should Blacks be thinking ourselves about our own aspiration, and whether or not the transcendence of race, this is what Thomas Chatterton Williams is after. He's talking about identity. He's asking the question, should his daughter, he himself is of mixed ancestry, his mother is white and his father is Black. Chatterton Williams is married to a French woman who will be white. So his daughter is, quote unquote, 1/4 Black. I mean, and so he's now asking, what does that mean? Okay. Should I go on believing in race in this kind of transgenerational, essentialist way? Or is there space for a broader sense of self? You know, a transcendent humanistic understanding of what it means to be alive in the world. I am a Black man, but I'm many things. I'm I have to willfully trim huge branches off of my family tree in order to stand before you as a Black man. I have to ignore the Irish and the Scotch ancestors that I have. My name is Loury, after all, who are a part of the bloodline. That's a choice. And Thomas is working on that issue. And I think that's very important. But even if one were to cling to racial identity as an essential part of one's essence, I want to say, just as people cling to Armenian identity or Jewish identity or whatever as an essential part of their being. I want to say that the republic, which is the United States of America, the constitutional republic, which is the United States of America, constitutes a context within which those aspirations can be most effectively realized. And therefore, it deserves to be endorsed, supported, embraced, loved, fought for, and died for, heaven forbid, should it come to that, by African Americans every bit as much as anybody else. And that this posture of saying, oh, no, 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 don't you know about slavery? Don't you know that Abraham Lincoln was not politically correct? They want to take down his statue. They want to take his name off of school buildings. This is sophomoric. I'm saying it's childish, just throwing a tantrum. It's not really understanding the foundation of your own security and your own prosperity, and the most effective way to advance your own interests going forward. That's the kind of argument that I'm making. So we're not in disagreement, but I'm distinguishing between Thomas's looking for air to breathe and space to be a human being in a complex world, and wanting not to be confined by racial identity as this kind of heavy coat that you have to wear. You have to wear it. You can't take it off. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But that's arguable. A lot of people will say assimilation is a bad thing. And I don't want to argue with them right here, right now about that point. I want to argue about the republic and about whether or not we should, quote unquote, love it. Not uncritically, but understanding what it actually represents in the development of human civilization over the last 500 years.
So another follow-up on just that train, because in much of your writing for decades and in your remarks tonight, you're not denying a horrible history of racism against the descendants of African slaves brought from Africa, their descendants, et cetera. You use the word Holocaust tonight, but could I put it this way? Your argument is that against an Ibram X. Kendi or others who say we are a systemically racist country today, your argument is if they were correct, they would not have nearly the influence and the power in elite circles, from higher education to national media to, as you said, the HR departments of Fortune 500 companies, and the list would go on. If their argument was correct, they couldn't possibly have the influence they have. And so there is this paradox about their argument, but it still can't be true. Is that one way of saying what you're after?
Once again, I appreciate your rephrasing. I mean, it certainly is in keeping with what I'm trying to argue. That is one of my points, that the very receptiveness of the halls of power in Hollywood, in corporate America, in American politics, both parties, in the universities, in the professions, in the culture, in the publishing houses, in the editorial pages. The very fact that this sensibility is so widely embraced by powerful American institutions suggests to me that the simplistic story, white supremacist society, America systemically racist, Black people's bodies erased, Black people's voices unheard, it's just contradicted by the facts. So there's that, but I think there's even a deeper contradiction, which is that the appeals that are being made in the voice of white supremacists, domineering, hegemonic, racist, whatever, where you're accusing the society of being all of these things, and yet you're appealing to the society to respond to your demands. We demand. Why would they respond to your demand effectively if indeed they were what you accuse them of being? As I say, you throw yourself on the mercy of a court which you have already declared to be completely unwilling to hear your case. What strategy is that? It makes me conclude that this is really not about affecting any political outcome whatsoever. This is about a tantrum. This is about performance. It's about an emotional display. And since it solicits a positive response from a sufficient number of quarters of people, white people, who are looking not to be called racist, or who are seeking to be on the right side of history, or are trying to demonstrate to other white people What is the NBA trying to do when it put Black Lives Matter on the side of the court or whatever? It doesn't want a labor relations problem with its athletes, and it wants good branding. Nike wants good branding. General Motors wants good branding. They don't want Jesse Jackson from a time past or Black Lives Matter today or Al Sharpton marching in front of their corporate headquarters. They don't want a bad news story in Business Week or in the New York Times that hurts their the value of their securities or the marketing prospects of their company. So I don't know what these people who talk about a white supremacist society indifferent to Black humanity are talking about when they ignore the very fact of their own power and when they fail to recognize that they're making an appeal, the effectiveness of which is negated by the very premises of their argument. They're appealing to racists to get Black people out of the fix that we're in. They call racist, putative racist.
Yeah. Well, I have a few more questions for you, and then I want to remind our audience watching to submit some questions. Carol McNamara says we have some great questions already coming to you in the third part from our audience. But two last questions for me. You called out earlier in your remarks, and you did just now, that you disagree with groups like Black Lives Matter or Colin Kaepernick. You also disagree strongly with the New York Times editors in their view about America and its history and its achievement. I want to mention one other group, which is a matter of public record that I think you have disagreed with. You disagreed with your own university president in the past year, statements made about systemic racism in American higher education. So what in particular would you want university faculty, university deans and provosts to be thinking about as they consider what changes in curriculum, obviously in the wake of the George Floyd killing, but the 1619 Project as well? What could you say, adapt from your remarks tonight to have faculty, deans, provosts thinking about curriculum, about even more aggressive, say, affirmative action or set aside hiring programs to redress past racism or current inequalities in proportions of people of color or Black people on the faculty? Just whatever you'd like to offer in terms of adapting this, particularly to the higher education environment.
Okay. Let me explain, Paul, first that what I was objecting to in the letter, my very fine woman, Christina Paxson, who's president of Brown University. She's my colleague in economics, had a distinguished career as a researcher, come from Princeton, has come to Brown and has been president for, 7, 8 years and so on. And she put out a letter after George Floyd was killed, basically expressing solidarity of the university community with people of color, Black people, in our struggle against racism, reciting chapter and verse of the popular narrative about systemic racism. I thought it was something that a committee of the Black Lives Matter support group here in Providence could easily have written. It was tendentious. It interpreted disputable and controversial matters through a unitary lens. And it was signed in lockstep by all of the top administrators, deans, vice presidents, provosts, general counsel, and what of the university. So it had the imprimatur of an official university statement. I just want to say that I objected to that because I thought it was not the place of the university to jump on a political bandwagon and to incant slogans, which in my opinion is what this letter represented. It's the place of the university to think these difficult matters through, just elementarily, very fundamentally. Was what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis a racial incident in continuous historical connection with other racial incidents of lynching and physical abuse of Black people by sources of authority? I declare here and now that that's an arguable question. I'm not trying to decide it. I'm just saying reasonable people could take different positions on that question. The university should not be in the business of giving political speeches. The university should be in the position of thinking these matters through, of trying to marshal the reason and the expertise on behalf of rational deliberation about these questions. So I thought that it was just too easy. It was too easy to wave a banner or jump on it. And that's what I want to say about that. You ask me, what should the university do? Well, I can tell you what the university is going to do. It's going to do diversity and inclusion. It's going to redouble the effort to increase Black faculty. It's going to enhance its affirmative action program. It's going to interrogate the curriculum to see whether or not it comports with this or that fad and fancy about what it is that's appropriate to say about the struggle. What it ought to do, in my opinion, is argue these matters, because there are very different. For example, to what extent is the overrepresentation of African Americans in the criminal justice system a consequence of the failures of the development of African American personality in a large swath of the low-income population, because of structures of social organization characteristic of the community, because of the family, for example, because of the way educational institutions work, because of the way that institutions of incarceration work in terms of influencing the social ecology of the community and things of that kind? To what extent are the incidences, which are relatively rare, but they are still very emotionally powerful, of police violence involving Black men, embedded within a structure of police-citizen interaction freighted with the overrepresentation of African Americans amongst violent criminal offenders? Dare we even tolerate the inquiry of such a kind? Or to what extent are the mechanisms of advocacy, fundraising, activism, and organization, as they interact with the political institutions in the United States and so on, fostering backlash? I mean, these are questions that a person could ask. If I go on in this vein very much longer, I'll get myself into trouble, because all of this is extremely controversial. But that's what I want to see happening in a university. I don't want to see us sloganeering, and that's what I felt is going on too often. And one of the reasons it goes on is administrators want to manage the situation on campus, and they want not to give fuel to fire or to foster events that can spin out of control and that they can't, and that they'll be damaged by, that their political professional careers will be damaged by. So anyway, I could go on about this for a while, and I think we should allow for other questions, but I thought the university was poorly served by what was the easy path, which was simply to say, yeah, me too, amidst the furor, and to traffic in propaganda, which is what, in fact, that letter represented to me.
To follow up again on this, I know we will have a question from the audience about free discourse and having space to speak candidly but civilly about differing points of view on controversial points. But I just want to reinforce your point that you have respect for your colleague, Professor Paxson, yet also think it's part of the self-respect in a university community to be able to disagree about important and contentious questions. So one point I'm taking from you is that the first and foremost thing a university should do is make sure it's fostering debate and discussion in a reasonable way, because these are very complicated questions and we need good thinking that could inform policy. And then could I tease out this second part, and this is based on your longstanding economic research, which I know dates back to your doctoral work, that if universities are thinking about promoting policy interventions, they might think about addressing earlier interventions in life cycle or family and community, or the whole social context. That would be, universities might think about that rather than precise ratios of African Americans on the faculty or those sorts of questions.
Well, we needn't juxtapose those. They could, of course, do both. I have my own views about the ratios on the faculty, which we could talk about. Definitely, though, the former. Definitely a focus on the developmental processes that are underlying the outcomes that we see that are disparate. But I only gave that as an example because it's sensitive. I was trying to say that if you wanted to take a stand on behalf of an analytical and rational examination of questions that people approach mainly from emotion, which are very sensitive and fraught. That's precisely where the university, it seems to me, the university should be a safe space for political incorrectness, not a safe space for political correct. It's not should be a place where people feel safe by going there because they're not affronted by ideas that make them uncomfortable. It should be a safe space precisely for trafficking in the ideas that make one uncomfortable. Otherwise, why set up this enclave outside of the influences of day-to-day commercial and self-interested activity that's supposed to be a citadel, a place in society where open inquiry and reflection is taking place, and then freight it with all of this moral virtue signaling. You have to believe this, you have to believe that. How am I supposed to teach my class to undergraduates about race, crime, policing in America, and teach that there are legitimate pro-police positions, that there are huge parts of the American polity that think blue lives matter? They don't think that's racist to say it. How am I supposed to get my kids to take that seriously, to read some of those people, to debate with them, when the university has declared en masse and in lockstep that George Floyd's killing was a lynching? That's propaganda. That's twisting the language on behalf of a political agenda. It should, wiser heads would not have said that, who were in charge of a great university. That's my position. And I think we're swept up in this mania, and everyone has to do it because everyone else is doing it. And it's all pablum. None of it gets down to cases. The thing I'd say about how to respond is hiring more Black faculty is not the response to racial inequality in America. It may or may not be a good thing. It may or may not be a good thing. We can debate it. We can debate whether or not there are not enough Blacks in the physics department or the Italian Renaissance history specialty at this or that university. We could debate that. If you think you're dealing with racial inequality of America when you get into that head counting in one of the most elite venues of the society, you are wildly mistaken. What you're dealing with is the self-interested advocacy of particular groups of people who happen to be minorities on behalf of their own professional interest. I'm sorry, that's what that is. That's what we haven't had a Black head of this or that is. That is a very old political phenomenon, leveraging on behalf of your self-interest because you've got control of the microphone. It's not addressing the question of racial inequality, which is reflected in the lives of the scores of hundreds of thousands of people who are at the bottom of society, who are Black and brown, who are trapped in these enclaves where there's no opportunity, whose kids have to go to schools that fail, who are afraid for their physical safety when they step from their doors, who are hungry, who don't have a good housing, who have no good health care in a pandemic. That's equality for American people and for people of color. But counting the color of the faculty members at an elite university is a luxury. It's an indulgence. It's not a deep issue of social justice.
Well, thank you. We have some terrific questions that have come in from the audience. And some have, you've already addressed, and we've talked about the importance of free discourse. We might get back to that, but I want to start with a challenging question from Antonio in our audience. 2 different points he asks, how could someone be considered equal if you say that someone in this population has to earn rights and dignity when those elements seem to have been given to another population? And then a related question, if America is in its historical ideals and achievement exceptional and great, should we just stop comparing ourselves to standards in other countries? We should stop comparison, we're just unique. Those 2 points.
well, I want to say flat out and without equivocation, you don't have to earn rights. You don't have to earn your rights to be treated without discrimination, to be afforded the privileges and the immunities of citizenship. That's an endowment. You don't have to earn that. When I say earn equality, what I mean is, okay, so the jails are overflowing with brown men and women who are being incarcerated for having committed crimes. They've been found guilty under the criminal law, and they're being confined and they're being punished. It's a huge disparity. It makes us ashamed, some of us. It makes us angry. It is in part, but only in a small part, a reflection of overt discriminatory treatment. It is in the main part a reflection of huge disparities in the behavior of individuals in terms of criminal offending for which they get in are being apprehended and punished. There are reasons for that. There are historical reasons for it. The depredations of economic discrimination against generation past should be cited as a part of that. Not the whole thing, but certainly a part of it. But it's inequality. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to make that more equal? If there's indignity in the overrepresentation amongst criminal offenders, and surely there is, surely it diminishes the reputation of a people that they would be overrepresented amongst criminal offenders. What do you propose to do about that? Well, now you can tinker with the law. You can make drug offending not a felony, but a misdemeanor. You can, et cetera. You can change the way police carry on their behaviors. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you've got too many kids running around with guns, firing them at each other in gang disputes, if you've got too much involvement in violence and mugging and in robbery and gang activity and so forth, you're going to not be equal in that respect. Likewise, look at the achievement gap in education, not just in colleges and universities. Look at the difference in the proficiency of reading and mathematics of adolescent Americans. There are huge racial disparities, with Black 17-year-olds reading and writing and counting at the level of white 13-year-olds on the average. That's unequal. There's no way that that is not manifesting itself later in life in terms of employment outcomes and so on and so forth. You want to do something about that? You want to not be unequal in that way? Okay. Again, we can talk about what kind of schooling, we can have a debate about the budgets and whatnot, but ultimately, nobody can do that for you. No one can educate your children for you. There is the facility of the public institution, but the responsibility comes to the community at the end of the day. Many examples of this kind. So equal dignity, respect, and standing, not equal citizenship. The citizenship part carries with it the endowment of rights. And the violation of that bedrock is what you have civil rights laws for and should have them for. But there are differences in society. And I'm arguing that the inequality that history has bequeathed us, unfairly so, nevertheless confronts African Americans with the inescapable necessity of, quote unquote, making ourselves equal. That's the sense in which I meant it. And I think it's a deep problem. It's a deep philosophical problem, because if you rely on the other to come to your rescue, that is in itself an unequal, asymmetric relationship. There's a patron and there's a client there. There's someone who has the capacity to respond to your demand or not. That's a moral agent. There's someone who has the facility in the world to make it so that you have a better outcome or not. That's power. So that's what I meant. I don't know if that's clear or not. Now, as far as comparing the United States to other countries, I did wave the flag a little bit during my remarks. I grant you that. I did say the greatest in history and the world historic and whatnot. I did say fighting the fascists and defeating the communists and whatnot. I did say all of that. The US is clearly a leading country in world history over the last 3 centuries, clearly so. America was the China of the 19th century in terms of our emergence as an industrial power, the burgeoning economic growth, attracting capital investment, building the railroads, the industrialization, and so forth and so on. Clearly, America is a leader in world culture, not just in popular culture, but also in very, fundamental, et cetera, et cetera. So I did wave the flag a little bit, but I was asking the question about Black Americans and patriotism. I wasn't as much comparing America to France or America to Ethiopia as I was saying, here we are, birthright citizens of this republic. Should we love it? Put love in inverted commas if you like. I don't mean blind, fealty. I mean, should we embrace the project as ours? Are we defining ourselves in opposition to it? The white man, I remember this thing from back in the 60s when I was a kid. Rat then bit my sister Nell and Whitey is on the moon. This was, 1969, 1970. This is Gil Scott-Heron. Rat then bit my sister Nell and Whitey's on the moon. Okay, were we on the moon when Americans landed? Amazingly, they landed on the surface and walked on the surface of the moon. Did we walk there? Why not? Why would I not say that we are on the moon? That's what I'm talking about.
Thank you. So now a question, changing topics, from our colleague Ross Emmett, a professor of economics in our school, who puts the question this way. My economics students tell me that all Americans, but especially Blacks, are worse off today despite the historical gains you identified, because inequality is greater in various economic terms than it has been for decades. So if you were in my class as a visiting guest, what would you say to these economic students?
I'd say, okay, let's look at the numbers. Inequality is greater, that's for sure. You say all Americans are better off. I think we're going to need an argument there, because the ones who are actually at the top of the distribution, inequality, they're worse off too for the equality? Maybe so, indirect. Let's talk about it. I'd say that. But I'd say, you don't like inequality? Let's stop talking about race and start talking about class. If you're really serious about inequality, dusty town in the Midwest, which has gotten wiped out by globalization and trade. People who no longer have skills that are marketable or whatever it might be. Schools that are really not educating people. I mean, Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, Charles Murray, Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids. These are books that chronicle, amongst Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance's book about growing up in southwestern Ohio and northeastern Kentucky, hill country and whatnot like that. There are a lot of poor white people in this country. There are a lot of disadvantaged white people. If I wanted to talk about inequality, I would stop so much talking about race and I would talk more about class. That's the kind of thing that I would be inclined to say to the students.
A question about that I'll try to rephrase. How can you make the argument that the discourse about inequality and systemic racism in elite culture is so wrong, when in fact, as you've said yourself, there is such a degree of class inequality that predominantly affects Black Americans, from incarceration to economic circumstance. So I guess this is a reverse way of asking, doesn't there have to be some systemic racism behind such enormous class, economic, social opportunity disparities? That it isn't just Hollywood and the NBA and academics making something out of nothing. There's something there. There must be something there.
I'm not understanding the question. I mean, there is enormous class inequality and there is racial inequality, and Blacks are overrepresented at the lower strata of the class hierarchy. But how does that amount to systemic racism? I mean, let me give an example. New Orleans floods. The low-lying areas are the first to get wiped out by the water. We look after the fact at the racial disparity in the people who took a hard hit on the flood. It's going to show Blacks overrepresented amongst those who are dispossessed. Overrepresented because they're poor. They're poor and they're living in the lower lying areas because the housing is more readily affordable there. The flood comes along. That is not a racist event in my way of seeing things. You could tell a racist narrative about it. You can say, well, the Blacks are poor because of a history of racism. But if I wanted to remedy the incidence of the flood having a racially disparate effect, I'd want to address myself to poverty. Even white poverty, should it fall within my purview. So I don't see the connection between the existence of extreme problems of inequality, which is real enough, and which will have Blacks overly represented amongst those disadvantaged on the one hand, and the necessary connection, and systemic racism on the other. I would prefer to go on a case-by-case basis. If you want to tell me that in my example, where people live in the New Orleans metropolitan area is a reflection of systemic racism, I'm not going to argue with you about the use of those words. I mean, okay, you want to tell it that way, you can go ahead and tell it that way. But it still didn't tell me what to do.
I think we have time for about 2 last questions. A general question of some authors you particularly recommend who are writing today about these questions of race and justice in America, other critics of systemic racism as a theory, or race essentialism or race consciousness as a theory. So that's one. And then I have a more specific question about a kind of author.
Authors, well, that's something I should actually write up something for. I mean, but I can, I'll come up with a few things. Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, about housing insecurity in Milwaukee is worth people's attention. Rogers Brubaker's book, Ethnicity Without Group. He's a theorist. He's a social theorist at UCLA. And he makes the argument that the way that we use racial categories is a result of our political interactions. It's not given in nature. I would recommend Thomas Chatterton Williams, his book, Losing My Cool. That's his first book.
Yeah.
It's a memoir of a young man coming of age, of intellectual age, a young Black man from suburban New Jersey, finding his way through his father's library and coming to love books and losing his cool in the process. Books of that kind, but I don't, there are many books. Okay, on the left, Khalil Muhammad, who's a professor of history at the Kennedy School at Harvard. His book is called The Condemnation of Blackness, and it's a history of American intellectual and political elites' views about race and crime and punishment at the end of the 19th and the early decades of the 20th century, arguing that African-American criminality is manifest in the populations migrating out of the South and into the Northeast and Midwestern cities in America, and European immigrant criminality, the Irish and Italian and Jewish lower classes coming along at roughly the same time, were read through entirely different lenses because of racial stigma and racial discrimination. Or Thomas Sugrue, S-U-G-R-U-E, The Origins of the Urban Crisis. This is now a classic work. It's a history of Detroit between 1945 and 1970, and tries to identify the underpinnings of the decline of Midwestern cities like Detroit in terms of racial problems in those cities. There are many books.
Yeah, well, that's a great start, though. And I think this might be our final questions from our friend James Stoner. And it would be, I guess, about a Christian subset of authors you might recommend. So he phrases it this way: the success of the civil rights movement under Dr. King's leadership was deeply Christian, and not least because it counseled repentance and forgiveness. Today, is there a distinctively Christian voice in the American racial conversation? Most of what he reads from BLM is at the very least unchristian. Dr. King himself is called doctor, but rarely called the Reverend. So what are your thoughts on that set of issues?
I guess I am not able to identify, and I regret this, a prominent leader who brings that Christian sensibility, such as we would identify with Martin Luther King Jr., to the contemporary discussion. Certainly, it's absent from Black Lives Matter's view of the world, as far as I understand it, and given the origins of the organization and the composition of the people who've been proponents of its agenda, perhaps that shouldn't be surprising. Times have changed. We are 60 years on from 1960. And the society has become perhaps more secular and more religiously diverse, if you include non-religion as a part of that diversity, than it was. Surely, as a historical matter, the Christian roots of the American Civil Rights Movement must be affirmed. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that my left-wing colleague, Cornel West, is a fervent Christian.
Yes.
He is an important public philosopher, and he never fails to evince and to assert the tenets of Christian morality, of forgiveness, and of brotherhood, and of humility before our position in God's dispensation. Cornel West never fails to give voice to that, so he is someone who should be mentioned here. But you know, we're not in 1960 anymore. I don't think there's any going back.
Very interesting. We talk a fair bit about patriotism and the concept of it in our teaching about civic education. That's also an enormous change. You're calling for Black patriotism, but the general attitude among all Americans, in a way, in schooling and in universities, toward being patriotic to the American ideals, that certainly has changed as well in 60 years. So that's a particular challenge, right?
Yeah, you know, I'm intending to be provocative here. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect. Here's what I want. So Colin Kaepernick decides to take a knee. I'm dead set against it. Okay. Never mind what Trump had to say about it. That's not my point. I'm dead set against it because I'm saying, look, okay, you have a beef, the cops, you got a beef. Why make this ceremony of national celebration the site, the place where you decide to express your beef, as if there was something fundamentally wrong with the country? We need the country to solve this problem. We need 50% plus one at the ballot box to win an election. We're Americans here. Why gratuitously invoke a kind of anti-nationalist stance on behalf of a project which requires national collaboration in order to bear fruit? I just thought it was a grandstand kind of move. And there are many such grandstand moves. America spelled with a K is childish. It's just not engaging with the actual reality that we confront. So, you know, that's a kind of sentiment that's pushing me. And yeah, I put it in stick figure terms. I paint it with bright colors so that everybody could see what I was trying to say.
Well, thank you so much for this. We run out of time. I will add a note for the audience that when we talked before tonight's event, you mentioned that you're teaching a course about freedom of discourse. And the part of the importance of that is risking being provocative. So you said you're starting with Socrates and the Apology, among other texts, and going on to John Milton. So you're in that tradition of being deliberately provocative to wake us up and get us to think in a different way of being woke, I think.
Yeah, we're talking about Milton's Areopagitica tomorrow. But I don't quite like the way that Socrates thing worked out. I mean, the hemlock part.
Well, that's another advantage of the American constitutional order and that First Amendment thing, that you're supposed to be legally protected. Yeah. Well, let me make a few words of thanks before I give a final word of thanks to you, Glenn. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for this 6th webinar in our theme this year in the Civic Discourse Project, which is on race, justice, and leadership in America. Please check on our website, scetl.asu.edu, for the video catalog tab. It has recordings of the first 5 webinars in this series on George Washington, discussion with Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School, discussion on Frederick Douglass, another one on Lincoln's views of America and race, And then, as I mentioned, with our discussion for the Martin Luther King annual lecture event with Thomas Chatterton Williams. You can also check on the website for the 2 episodes we have still coming in the series, a discussion with author Shelby Steele, and our final session discussing Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. As always, I thank our colleagues in the school who made this webinar possible, Dr. Carol McNamara, our Associate Director for Public Programs, Joe Martin, who is our Communications Manager and Zoom Wizard, and Morgan Raddick from our events team. Enormous thanks again to our guest, Glenn Loury, for sharing his expertise and his insights and his provocations to being awake in these very hard conversations. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. Be well and good night.